All right, folks, so this is going to be domain one. We're going to cover a lot of territory here, but in order for us to really dive into the content and topics that we're going to cover here in domain one, it's important for us to first understand a lot of the basic security concepts that we're going to see throughout this course and what you're going to see throughout the cissp. So we're going to start understanding some basic security topics. When we look at the different types of terms and what we're really trying to do in sense of security, we see this wheel. You have threats, you have vulnerabilities, you have exposures, you have risk, you have safeguards, and you have assets. Assets are the things that we assign value to. Threats are the things that endanger those assets. The threats can take advantage of exploits. The vulnerabilities can create exposures, and those become risks to the organization. And the way we mitigate those risks or remediate them, and we'll talk a lot about risk coming up, but the way that we try to protect ourselves against those risks are through safeguards or controls. And those are really, you can think of those as the protection mechanisms that we put in place to protect those assets against those threats. So there's a basic CIA triad concept that most people are very familiar with when it comes to security: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And these three terms, these three concepts are really what everything in security comes down to. It's protecting the confidentiality, which is protecting data, making sure that only authorized people have access to it. Integrity, meaning that the data is always trusted and known to be correct. And then availability is that the systems or the data is available when it's needed by authorized people. So some other terms that we're going to talk about around confidentiality is sensitivity, criticality, concealment, secrecy, privacy, and isolation. So sensitivity is how sensitive is that information, and what would be the impact if it was disclosed? Is it highly sensitive? Is it public information? Criticality, the higher criticality means the higher level of confidentiality. So if it's critical information to the organization, then you're going to want to have stronger confidentiality protections around it. Concealment means hiding the data. It doesn't necessarily mean encrypting, but it means hiding it through obfuscation. Secrecy means keeping something secret and preventing it from disclosure. Privacy is any data that's PII, and we're going to talk about PII a lot in this course, but personally identifiable information. We want to make sure that that information stays confidential. Isolation means keeping something separated from something else. So the other concept is integrity. And this is basically ensuring that data can't be modified by unauthorized subjects. This also means that not necessarily intentional, but there's also unintentional modification of information. And that could also be an integrity breach. So keeping data as correct and true reflection of the real world is the goal of integrity. Availability. We all know that when you can't get to, if you're trying to get to a website and it's unavailable, maybe your network's down or something to that effect. That's frustrating, but that's an availability issue. So availability should be something that is easy to use, learn, and understand as a function of usability. In other words, availability doesn't necessarily mean that the system is down. If the system is unusable or too complicated to use, that could also become an availability issue. You want to make sure that the system or the data is accessible to a wide audience of subjects, regardless of their capabilities. So that means that regardless of what role they're in, what their ability to view. So accessibility. When we think about accessibility, we're really talking about people that maybe are vision impaired or hearing impaired. And you want to make sure that those systems that you're trying to provide to people are accessible to everybody. And you also, the basic fundamental part of availability is making sure that the responsiveness is there, and the system or the data or the website in some cases, you want to make sure that it responds in a reasonable amount of time. So when we have the CIA, what we're doing is we're protecting against confidentiality, protects against disclosure, integrity protects against alteration, and availability protects against things like destruction. So what about some other terms that we have here? So identification. And again, we're going to cover a lot of these things coming up throughout this course, but this is really just to lay the foundations here. So with identification, we're making a claim on an identity in order to access an area or system. In other words, if you work at a company, you may have an ID badge that you use to get through security. That's also sort of related to authentication. It means that you're proving your claimed identity. Authorization means that you have access to a certain area or certain material. One thing to keep in mind is that authentication and authorization are similar, but they are absolutely, different in the sense that if I have an identity, let's say I'm working at my company, just because I have a ID badge that shows that, hey, this is Derek Fisher, doesn't mean that I have access to every part of the building. So that's the difference between authentication and authorization. My authentication shows who I am, but the authorization shows or dictates where I'm allowed to go. Last two here, auditing. So auditing is, you can think of it as logging. You want to record events. You want to make sure that you have enough information about activity that is happening to the system or about the system or any subjects that are accessing this system. And accounting means that you're reviewing that auditing information to make sure that there's no violation of security policy. Last couple terms here, defense in depth. So this concept is really about layering in different parts of security to provide a broader and more robust security around what we're trying to protect. So if you think about the very common way of thinking about defense in depth is the castle. You have walls, you have a moat, you have gates, you have archers and things like that. And so the goal there is that you're not relying on one system to provide protection. You're relying on all those different aspects of the system working together to be able to provide a more robust security. Abstraction means applying security controls to a group of objects grouped by type or function. So in other words, you're applying all those security controls in a specific category. Data hiding means that you're preventing data from being discovered or accessed by a subject. And then encryption means you're hiding the meaning of an object from unintended subjects. So we're all somewhat familiar with what encryption is. It's basically changing the meaning of something, or taking data from one state into another that makes it so that it's not readable by unintended subjects. And with that, we're going to move on into some other topics coming up, and thank you for your time.